I decided to do this without fail, so that this initial chapter of mine, predetermined, as I have already said, to awaken your consciousness, should fully justify its purpose, and reaching not only your, in my opinion, as yet only fictitious consciousness, but also your real consciousness. That is to say, what you call your subconscious might, for the first time, compel you to reflect actively. In the entirety of every man, irrespective of his heredity and education, there are formed two independent consciousnesses, which in their functioning as well as in their manifestations have almost nothing in common. One consciousness is formed from the perception of all kinds of accidental, or on the part of others intentionally produced, mechanical impressions, among which must also be counted the consonances of various words, which are indeed, as is said, empty, and the other consciousness is formed from the, so to say, already previously formed material results, transmitted to him by heredity, which have become blended with the corresponding parts of the entirety of a man, as well as from the data arising from his intentional evoking of the associative confrontations of these materialized data already in him. The whole totality of the formation as well as the manifestation of this second human consciousness, which is none other than what is called the subconscious, and which is formed from the materialized results of heredity and the confrontations actualized by one's own intentions, should, in my opinion, formed by many years of my experimental elucidations during exceptionally favourably arranged conditions, predominate in the common presence of a man. As a result of this conviction of mine, which as yet doubtlessly seems to you the fruit of the fantasies of an afflicted mind, I cannot now, as you yourself see, disregard this second consciousness, and, compelled by my essence, am obliged to construct the general exposition even of this first chapter of my writings, namely, the chapter which should be the preface for everything further, calculating that it should reach and, in the manner required for my aim, ruffle the perceptions accumulated in both these consciousnesses of yours. Continuing my expositions with this calculation, I must first of all inform your fictitious consciousness that, thanks to three definite, peculiar data, which were crystallized in my entirety during various periods of my preparatory age, I am really unique in respect of the, so to say, muddling and befuddling of all the notions and convictions supposedly firmly fixed in the entirety of people with whom I come in contact. Tut, tut, tut! I already feel that in your false, but according to you real, consciousness, there are beginning to be agitated like blinded flies all the chief data transmitted to you by heredity from your uncle and mother, the totality of which data, always and in everything, at least engenders in you the impulse, nevertheless extremely good, of curiosity, as in the given case to find out as quickly as possible why I, that is to say, a novice at writing, whose name has not even once been mentioned in the newspapers, have suddenly become so unique. Never mind. I personally am very pleased with the arising of this curiosity, even though only in your false consciousness, as I already know from experience that this impulse, unworthy of man, can sometimes even pass from this consciousness into one's nature and become a worthy impulse, the impulse of the desire for knowledge, which in its turn assists the better perception and even the closer understanding of the essence of any object on which, as it sometimes happens, the attention of a contemporary man might be concentrated, and therefore I am even willing, with pleasure, to satisfy this curiosity which has arisen in you at the present moment. Now listen, and try to justify and not to disappoint my expectations. This original personality of mine, already smelled out by certain definite individuals from both choirs of the judgment seat above, whence objective justice proceeds, and also here on earth by as yet a very limited number of people, is based, as I already said, on 3 secondary specific data formed in me at different times during my preparatory age. The first of these data, from the very beginning of its arising, became as it were the chief directing lever of my entire wholeness, and the other 2, the vivifying sources as it were, for the feeding and perfecting of this first datum. The arising of this first datum proceeded when I was still only, as is said, a chubby mite. My dear now deceased grandmother was then still living and was 100 and some years old. When my grandmother, may she attain the kingdom of heaven, was dying, my mother, as was then the custom, took me to her bedside, and as I kissed her right hand, my dear now deceased grandmother placed her dying left hand on my head and in a whisper, yet very distinctly, said, "Eldest of my grandsons, listen and always remember my strict injunction to you. In life, never do as others do." Having said this, she gazed at the bridge of my nose, and evidently noticing my perplexity and my obscure understanding of what she had said, added somewhat angrily and imposingly, "Either do nothing, just go to school, or do something nobody else does." Whereupon she immediately, without hesitation and with a perceptible impulse of disdain for all around her, and with commendable self-cognizance, gave up her soul directly into the hands of his truthfulness, the Archangel Gabriel. I think it will be interesting and even instructive to you to know that all this made so powerful an impression on me at that time that I suddenly became unable to endure anyone around me, and therefore, as soon as we left the room where the mortal planetary body of the cause of my arising lay, I very quietly, trying not to attract attention, stole away to the pit where during Lent the bran and potato skins for our sanitarians, that is to say our pigs, were stored, and lay there, without food or drink, in a tempest of whirling and confused thoughts, of which, fortunately for me, I then had in my childish brain still only a very limited number, right until the return from the cemetery of my mother, whose weeping on finding me gone, and after searching for me in vain, as it were, overwhelmed me. I then immediately emerged from the pit, and standing first of all on the edge, for some reason or other with outstretched hand, ran to her, and clinging fast to her skirts, involuntarily began to stamp my feet, and why, I don't know, to imitate the braying of the donkey belonging to our neighbour, a bailiff. Why this produced such a strong impression on me just then, and why I almost automatically manifested so strangely, I cannot until now make out, though during recent years, particularly on the days called Shrovetide, I pondered a good deal, trying chiefly to discover the reason for it. I then had only the logical supposition that it was perhaps only because the room in which this sacred scene occurred, which was to have tremendous significance for the whole of my further life, was permeated through and through with the scent of a special incense brought from the monastery of Old Athos, and very popular among followers of every shade of belief of the Christian religion. Whatever it may have been, this fact still remains a bare fact. During the days following this event, nothing particular happened in my general state, unless there might be connected with it the fact that, during these days, I walked more often than usual with my feet in the air, that is to say, on my hands. My first act, obviously in discordance with the manifestations of others, though truly without the participation not only of my consciousness but also of my subconsciousness, occurred on exactly the 40th day after the death of my grandmother, when all our family, our relatives, and all those by whom my dear grandmother, who was loved by everybody, had been held in esteem, gathered in the cemetery according to custom, to perform over her mortal remains, reposing in the grave, what is called the requiem service, when suddenly, without any rhyme or reason, instead of observing what was conventional among people of all degrees of tangible and intangible morality and of all material positions, that is to say, instead of standing quietly as if overwhelmed, with an expression of grief on one's face, and even, if possible, with tears in one's eyes, I started skipping round the grave as if dancing, and sang, "Let her with the saints repose, now that she's turned up her toes, oi, oi, oi. Let her with the saints repose, now that she's turned up her toes," and so on and so forth. And just from this it began that in my entirety a something arose which, in respect of any kind of, so to say, aping, that is to say, imitating the ordinary automatized manifestations of those around me, always and in everything engendered what I should now call an irresistible urge to do things not as others do them. At that age I committed acts such as the following. If, for example, when learning to catch a ball with the right hand, my brother, sisters, and the neighbours' children who came to play with us threw the ball in the air, I, with the same aim in view, would first bounce the ball hard on the ground, and only when it rebounded would I, first doing a somersault, catch it, and then only with the thumb and middle finger of the left hand. Or if all the other children slid down the hill head first, I tried to do it, and moreover each time better and better, as the children then called it, backside first. Or if we children were given various kinds of what are called Aberranian pastries, then all the other children, before putting them in their mouths, would first of all lick them, evidently to try their taste and to protract the pleasure, but I would first sniff one on all sides, and perhaps even put it to my ear and listen intently, and then, though only almost unconsciously, yet nevertheless seriously, muttering to myself, "So and so and so you must, do not eat until you bust," and rhythmically humming correspondingly, I would only take one bite, and without savouring it would swallow it, and so on and so forth. The first event during which there arose in me one of the two mentioned data which became the vivifying sources for the feeding and perfecting of the injunction of my deceased grandmother occurred just at that age when I changed from a chubby mite into what is called a young rascal, and had already begun to be, as is sometimes said, a candidate for a young man of pleasing appearance and dubious content. And this event occurred under the following circumstances, which were perhaps even specially combined by fate itself. With a number of young rascals like myself, I was once laying snares for pigeons on the roof of a neighbour's house, when suddenly one of the boys who was standing over me and watching me closely said, "I think the noose of the horsehair ought to be so arranged that the pigeon's big toe never gets caught in it, because, as our zoology teacher recently explained to us, during movement it is just in that toe that the pigeon's reserve strength is concentrated, and therefore if this big toe gets caught in the noose, the pigeon might of course easily break it." Another boy, leaning just opposite from me, from whose mouth, by the way, whenever he spoke, saliva always splashed abundantly in all directions, snapped at this remark of the first boy and delivered himself, with a copious quantity of saliva, of the following words: "Shut your trap, you hopeless mongrel offshoot of the Hottentots. What an abortion you are, just like your teacher. Suppose it is true that the greatest physical force of the pigeon is concentrated in that big toe, then all the more, what we've got to do is to see that just that toe will be caught in the noose. Only then will there be any sense to our aim, that is to say, for catching these unfortunate pigeon creatures, in that brain particularity proper to all possessors of that soft and slippery something, which consists in this, that when, thanks to other actions from which its insignificant manifestability depends, there arises a periodic requisite law-conformable what is called change of presence, then this small, so to say, law-conformable confusion, which should proceed for the animation of other acts in its general functioning, immediately enables the centre of gravity of the whole functioning, in which this slippery something plays a very small part, to pass temporarily from its usual place to another place, owing to which there often obtains in the whole of this general functioning unexpected results ridiculous to the point of absurdity." He discharged the last words with such a shower of saliva that it was as if my face were exposed to the action of an atomizer, not of ersatz production, invented by the Germans for dyeing material with aniline dyes. This was more than I could endure, and without changing my squatting position, I flung myself at him, and my head, hitting him with full force in the pit of his stomach, immediately laid him out, and made him, as is said, lose consciousness. I do not know, and do not wish to know, in what spirit the result will be formed in your mentation of the information about the extraordinary coincidence, in my opinion, of life circumstances which I now intend to describe here, though for my mentation this coincidence was excellent material for the assurance of the possibility of the fact that this event described by me, which occurred in my youth, proceeded not simply accidentally, but was intentionally created by certain extraneous forces. The point is that this dexterity was thoroughly taught me only a few days before this event by a Greek priest from Turkey who, persecuted by Turks for his political convictions, had been compelled to flee from there, and having arrived in our town, had been hired by my parents as a teacher for me of the modern Greek language. I do not know on which data he based his political convictions and ideas, but I very well remember that in all the conversations of this Greek priest even while explaining to me the difference between the words of exclamation in ancient and in modern Greek, there were indeed always very clearly discernible his dreams of getting as soon as possible to the island of Crete, and there manifesting himself as befits a true patriot.